A war that I have not really seen talked about as widely is the world's worst war you aren't watching is in Ethiopia. And this is by Elizabeth Shackelford. And so this is October 23rd, 2022. And right here is a group of militias. Members of an Afar militia stand in a checkpoint at an entrance of a town of Abala, 480 kilometers of Samara, Ethiopia, on June 8th, 2022. So Afara region, the only passageway for humanitarian convoys bound for Tigray, is itself facing a serious food crisis due to the combined efforts or effects of the conflict of the northern Ethiopia and the drought in the Horn of Africa, which have notably caused numerous population displacements. And so this is what's going on here. So while the world's eyes are trained on the war of Ukraine, whether Vladimir Putin is unhinged enough to use nuclear weapons, another war rages mostly unseen, some 3,000 miles away in Ethiopia. The war is centered on the northern region of Tigray, where a long-standing political conflict between Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front turned violent in 2020, so the region has been under a near total blockade for most of the time since, cut off from humanitarian aid, electricity, telecommunications, and banking, leaving 5.3 million civilians in dire straits. So the Ethiopian government renewed offensive has escalated the crisis even further. And so this is what's going on over there. And this is why people may not know how bad it is, but here it's telling, accurately estimating the dead while war continues is difficult, but the best estimates available suggest that at least 500,000 people have died so far from direct violence, starvation, lack of access to health care. Starvation seems to be a feature rather than a bug in the government's battle plan. More recent estimates suggest that this number have died in combat alone, possibly bringing the overall deaths closer to 1 million. So to put it in perspective, the United Nations estimates 6,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine so far, and the estimates put military deaths in the tens of thousands. And so even if the estimates are low, the best available numbers suggest that the scale of death in Ethiopia exceeds that in Ukraine many times over. So that's what people aren't seeing. And yet Ethiopia has received a small fraction of attention, and both from policymakers and the media. And so my thing is that possibly because the country Ethiopia is primarily black and are other African people, and it's not looked in high regard as a developed country to some. Maybe they feel it's insignificant, and I'm just saying this is in my opinion, that they don't make as much of attention to it as they do what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, because Russia and Ukraine, although we see that this war is pretty bad, when you look at it, these are people that are white, are people that are European. It's more European people that they look at this, and I have to say this, and I'm not saying this to be mean or anything, but it's the same way that people will look at the Jewish Holocaust and they see that it was horrible, and they have a lot of empathy, and people want to reach out and they want to understand and study, and they want to try to remember what happened, and it's looked at as a tragedy and something that shouldn't be repeated, and there's movies, books, and everything, and it looks like people will tend to be more supportive. And I'm trying to say this in the I don't know how to say this in any other way. And I feel like a lot of it is, even though there's so many hateful individuals, groups that are out there that say horrible things against Jewish members, people, or people of the Jewish community, you'll still have a large support, it seems as though, because at the end of all of it, this group can assimilate a little better to the white culture in America, a little better than black people, of course. And when you talk about the Black Holocaust or slavery or the slave trade, it is met with such anger and animosity and unempathizing comments, and people who don't want to even go into conversations about it and try to evade it or look at it as though well, we had Obama, or we've had many advancements, and we have had things that have been positive, but there's still this sentiment that people of color are extremely insignificant and they don't matter. And this would be another example, I feel, is to reason why there's not enough attention from policymakers in the media over what is going on and happening in Ethiopia with their war. So the U.S. and others must make more direct approach before the worst fears of the Tigrayan people are realized. So those fears include genocide of people of Tigray, and in response to the latest offensive, the United Nations, African Union, and United States and other countries have called on all sides to cease hostilities, but the generic calls for everyone to stop fighting and quiet behind the scene of diplomacy that has been a favored approach so far, and are woefully inadequate responses. And so Tigrayan authorities have indicated that they would respect a ceasefire, but Ethiopian government officials have instead doubled down on a lambast the evils of its enemy. So meanwhile, Ethiopian government has reportedly dropped leaflets in Tigray stating that anyone remaining behind would be considered a combatant, raising clear concerns that all Tigrayans, a distinct ethnic group, would be targets in an assault. So sources from the area claim Ethiopian and Eritrean forces, their allies, have been instructed to kill 3 Tigrayans each, including elderly and the children as well, and that victims' limbs and skulls are on display. And so these stories are unverified given the lack of humanitarian and media access to the region. But given the language and the actions of Ethiopia so far, along with the death toll and atrocities already committed, there is little reason not to take them seriously. So Eritrean's role has complicated efforts to reach a peace too. as few countries have any leverage to influence its actions, and the TPLF is its sworn enemy. So there is no guarantee that Eritrea will stop fighting, even if the Ethiopian government comes to the table. So while it's true that all sides have committed abuses, the scale is hardly comparable with Ethiopia and Eritrea committing the lion's share of wanton violence and harm against civilians throughout the conflict. And so when one side holds this level of responsibility for continuing conflict and suffering, those who hold any sway must speak out clearly and directly against it. So at this stage, peace looks like a long shot, but that does not excuse the inadequate efforts made so far. The United States, the U.S., the United Nations are often loath to invite criticism by directly calling out states for violent acts against their own people when those states are friends and partners, as Ethiopia is. And it says it won't likely end the war, but that is a weak excuse for not trying harder. The innocent people of Tigray deserve acknowledgement, and there is a chance that such international pressure, in combination with policy choices that reduce Ethiopia's support, so intentional institutions and individual countries alike could influence the path Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed chooses. So calling out the atrocities for what they are or would at least put Ethiopia and Eritrea on notice that the world is watching. And so a long arm of international justice could ultimately prevail. So offenders in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia and Sierra Leone, to name a few, ultimately face justice. And so we must stop shying away from uncomfortable conversations when so many lives are at stake. So if U.S. leverage is inadequate, we should press the countries who arm and support Ethiopia and Eritrea and the international financial institutions like the World Bank that keep the country afloat as its economy falters. So the time for quiet diplomacy is over. So the time for alarm has long since passed, echoing what we've heard repeatedly about the plight of Ukraine. If Ethiopia stops fighting, the war ends. But if Tigray stops fighting in the absence of international oversight and inclusive peace process, the impoverished people of Tigray might end instead. So, this is by Elizabeth Shackelford, who is a senior fellow on U.S. foreign policy at the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. And so, I saw this article because I haven't heard very much about Ethiopia and what they say is the worst war. I've heard some things about the African countries having a famine, a great famine, and so I believe this is one that I was faintly hearing about, and it hasn't really gone on to say very much about it. It's been rather quiet, actually. They haven't really said a whole lot about it. And so what I do know is I heard of flooding in some areas, and then that there was food that was scarce. I think there was certain foods that they depend on that wasn't coming in, or it was scarce. There were people running and looked like they were kind of scampering and fighting to get some type of food. But I'm hearing that there's also some other stuff going on in some other countries where gangs are taking over. It's crazy. So, it just never ends. But you notice you don't hear a lot about those countries. It's always the main focus is on the countries that have European war, or the countries that maybe have more or looked at as having more money. Um, so the other thing that I noticed alongside of this article is where they talk about nuclear war. And so nuclear war is real. I know some people think that maybe it's just scare talk, but out of the sun, a nuclear war is now a real danger as British and NATO weapons are already legitimate targets in Ukraine, Russia's foreign minister has warned. So it says nuclear war, World War III is now a real danger and British and NATO weapons are legitimate targets, warns Putin's chief. And so this was not very long ago that this article was put out. There's been other articles that have followed also. And so I noticed it says, I created a nuclear war survival kit. Here are 7 items everybody needs. This was 4 days ago out of the U.S. Sun. This one is out of the Wall Street Journal. France's nuclear reactors malfunction as energy crisis bites. And so the world's worst war is unfortunately what I just spoke on. And then it says 3 ways you'll be told we're at nuclear war with Putin and what you must do next. Brits will be alerted with 3 chilling ways that we are at nuclear war with Russia. Officials have blah, 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 blah. And this was 5 days ago out of the U.S. Sun. I don't think people are really looking at any of this because maybe they don't really believe, we're like this. We don't believe it until we actually see it happening. And so that's the unfortunate part. Kremlin warns of nuclear World War III will be catastrophic. This was October 13, 2022. So the Deputy Secretary of Russian President Vladimir Putin's Security Council warned on Thursday that Ukrainian calls for international community to take preventive strikes. And so with seeing this, it doesn't really feel comfortable at all. And so they say that nuclear war is catastrophic for all mankind, which I'm knowing this. But do the people that fight realize what they're doing or what they could do could also affect them as well? So Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correct, and President Vladimir Putin. So I guess that was the 2 photographs of them pictured here. So I don't know if you can see it like I'm seeing it. I'll try to pan it up. But the threat of nuclear war is inevitable if you have people fighting over resources, right? And so it looks like that's what's been going on for the most part. What I've been seeing, and it doesn't look good at all. I keep trying to pan up. I don't know if you can see what I'm seeing, but yeah, you might just see Vladimir Putin. You may not see the other person, but then, I don't know, I was trying to see if maybe this screen has a photograph of the 2 of them. But, yeah, so it is imminent. These threats are imminent. And what's so scary is when they talk about how the nuclear war could be catastrophic. If you only knew, the Deputy Secretary of Russian President Vladimir Putin's Security Council, he warned Thursday that Ukrainian calls for the international community to take preventative strikes or actions against Russia are a call for World War III and a nuclear conflict that would be catastrophic for all mankind. In an interview with the Russian state-run TASS news agency, Kremlin Security Council Deputy Sheriff Alexander Vladimir warned if the Western nations supporting Ukraine decided to use weapons of mass destruction, of course, on Russia. So it would all but guarantee World War III. So Did you need me to repeat that? Yes, it is just like that. So in an interview with the Russian state-run TASS news agency, Kremlin Security Council Deputy Secretary Alexander Vendatov warned if Western nations supporting Ukraine, if we support Ukraine in what they're going through with, as Russia has sort of, well, we don't even say sort of, they invaded the Ukrainian country to use weapons of mass destruction on Russia. If we were to use any weapons, it would all but guarantee World War III. So that is basically letting you know what length they would go to if we intervened. The Western countries intervened in that war. So then the Tov comments come days after Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky called for the West to carry out preventative strikes against Russia before it uses its nuclear weapons, and to eliminate possibility that Russia will use nuclear strikes. So Russia's government has taken Zelensky's words as a call for the West to preemptively use nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction against Russia. So Zelensky's spokesman, Sergei Nikiforov, I may not be saying it correctly, sorry about that, later claimed Zelensky's comment was misinterpreted. And so he meant to say preventative measures. So that might be far too late now, because instead of preventative strikes. So once you say something like that, it might be a little too late, because, can you imagine somebody seeing this and then it sets them off? It's a trigger. And it said Zelensky was only calling for sanctions in his request to eliminate the possibility of a Russian nuclear attack. So notice how they want to switch up on the language, because when you're saying things like this, you could potentially set off what they don't want to happen is World War III with nuclear weapons involved, which would be really deadly to all mankind in some shape, form, or fashion. So Russian officials are still treating Zelensky's comments as a call for potentially nuclear strikes, despite Zelensky's amended call for action. See what I said? Russian officials have never voiced a threat to use any weapons of mass destruction. Meanwhile, in Europe, some politicians openly call for such actions. So Vendikov told TASS, so even a number of politicians in the EU do not conceal and do not rule out the possibility of using weapons of mass destruction against Russia. So Vladimir says Zelensky's words are not just some kind of remark, but an open call for a third world war, which is that there could be no winners in that one. And so the Kremlin official went on to say, in the West, fewer and fewer people remember that what war is, so they lose touch with reality and do not understand how dangerous such appeals are and what the consequences may be. And I wonder, do you feel the same way about you? When you look at it, it can affect you as well, So for some reason, that's me saying that. Many believe that nuclear war can be waged locally, he added, but we must remember a nuclear conflict will affect absolutely the whole world, exactly, and not only Russia and the collective West, but in general any country on this planet. Its consequences will be catastrophic for all mankind. So in another segment of his TASS interview, Vladimir also warned against Ukraine joining the North Atlantic Treaty, which is NATO, saying it would mean a guaranteed escalation of the same catastrophic outcome as a preemptive strike on Russia, World War III. And so Ukraine's accession to NATO or some other alliance formed under the auspice of the U.S. is unacceptable for us, Lendatov said. So Lendatov's comments are at the latest series of the Russian warnings about nuclear war. And so I believe that might be it could be almost all. So last month, Putin said that Western nations have even resorted to nuclear blackmail, is what they call it. And so I would like to remind those who make such statements regarding Russia that our country has different types of weapons as well, and some of them are more modern than the weapons NATO's countries have. So Putin added at the time, so the event of the threat to the territorial integrity of our country and to defend Russia and our people, we will certainly make use of all weapon systems available to us. And this is not a bluff. It's basically what they said. It's not a bluff. So they're basically telling you what could happen. It's what we don't want to happen is World War III.